Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701 Research Methods for Criminology. So this is a relatively short lecture to go through conceptualization, operationalization, and types of variables. So part of this lecture is going to help you with lab number 3 as far as picking out different kinds of variables, and it'll also help you with your final research project, which we'll start talking about more and more towards the end of this semester that's going to be coming in. Okay, so let's start with conceptualization. Conceptualization is essentially the process of forming a concept or idea of something. I tell people you need to pin it down. What does your concept include or exclude? So let me talk through that for a moment. When you conceptualize, it's when you take a topic and you say what you mean and mean what you say. When I say, I want to study drug use, this is what I mean by that. Okay? If I say, I want to study community policing, this is what I mean by that. And you describe the activities and the boundary lines, the definitions of that concept, so you know exactly what behavior you're looking at and what you're not looking at. So this way it keeps you in those boundaries, because if they aren't firmly defined, it gets really messy trying to measure or find variables to represent what it means, because it's loosey-goosey and you start measuring everything under the sun, and it's not tight and it's not simple and straightforward. So again, going on that example with drug use, if I have a student in class and they say, I want to study drug use, then I'm going to say, well, that's great, but I need your conceptualization of that. So are you talking about illegal drug use or legal drug use, or both maybe? About use of drugs or abuse of drugs? So use of drugs is everybody on the planet. Anyone that's taken a Tylenol has used drugs. So you have to decide what that means. Are you going to include prescription medications? What about adults or kids? Are you going to study both? Does age matter in the equation? Because we know some drugs are guided by age guidelines and laws. You have to be this age to use it. Are you talking about possession, transfer? Kind of just people having the drug, they're using it for sales or income? Are you talking about actual inhalation, shooting, or ingesting the drug? Or maybe you're talking about certain types of drugs. So these are things you'd have to get to the bottom of so that you have a nice tight definition or concept of what topic you want to measure. That way, when you go looking for variables in a data set, you can be more careful about what you select and not get on this runaway train of, oh, I don't really know what I mean by that, because then that'll waste your time and make you really frustrated in trying to get your question going. So here's a student example for drug use. This is actually a conceptualization that a student wrote in a paper for this class. The abuse of, addiction to, or regular recreational use of any drug or substance regulated by law and deemed harmful to the body. So this is really good. It starts to answer some of those questions. It's a much tighter concept of what drug use is, and it helps us better understand the kinds of things we're going to use to measure that. Okay, so again, this is what you have to think about when you first start picking topics to research, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Operationalization is how we measure things, the process of how we operate or measure the concept. So now that we have the concept down, we want to do some measurement. Okay, so we want to find things that represent that concept and let us observe it and see what happens. So example for drug use, this is actually what the student wrote in their paper. I have 6 drugs I want to focus on: illicit street drugs, inhalants, sedatives, stimulants, tranquilizers, pain relievers. People were asked if they abused any of these 6 drugs, with answer choices of yes or no. I want to combine all the answers, the yeses and nos, into a scale to see if any or all of the drugs were abused, and to be able to see how many drugs are being abused by each person in my data set. So this is them picking some variables, and maybe this one asked about stimulants, this one asked about sedatives, this one asked about tranquilizers. And they used those, the way they measured it, and kind of made this big, ginormous variable called drug use or drug abuse. And that was what they used as a variable in their paper. So this starts to get after, okay, we know what you mean by drug use. Now go make sure you can measure it in the way you have in mind. So operationalization is basically measurement. How do you want to measure it? How do you want to observe it? Okay, so let's go into variables one more time. And again, by review, what is a variable? Something that varies. Responses to a survey, a question, or an interview will vary person to person. We capture the responses inside a variable to account for all the ways that someone could respond. Or it could be all the variation inside a field of data, inside a database, all the different ways you could have information. Usually the name of a variable has to do with the topic being asked or the location in the survey. So all those lists on the screen, those are all variables. But now that we know what a variable is, let's go into independent, dependent, and control. So right here, what's an independent variable? I'm going to move myself. Independent variables, I call it the phenomena, okay? So a good way to say an independent variable is a predictor variable. What predicts an outcome? What happens first? So they usually occur on their own, independently, or before the result, sometimes in a time causal ordering where they happen in a sequence like that. They can be an identity or a status, a stimuli or an event, or something that's given for something else to happen. So I'm going to be really honest with you. I hated statistics, and I hated the words independent and dependent variable. They were very confusing, and I couldn't find the difference between an independent and dependent variable if my life depended on it. Okay, I was very confused by the wording and I could never get it quite right. But when I switched the word independent variable for predictor variable and the word dependent variable for the word outcome variable, it really helped me separate things a lot better. So use predictor and outcome for ways to kind of reason through the first few questions on your lab. I think that'll help a lot. Okay, dependent variables, the result, what happens? So I call these the outcome variables. Usually a situation or occurrence, a circumstance, or status. They only occur because of a given stimulus, a situation, or an intervention beforehand, the independent variable. So they depend on the independent variable that kind of is there by itself. Okay, so I again use outcome variable instead of dependent, just to be a little more clear. It's what happens, the result. Okay, so again, ask yourself, what's the predictor, what's the outcome when you're doing your lab? Now, one other kind of variable that we haven't mentioned quite yet in the lab, but we will come to later in the class, is what we call a control variable. Okay, those are just extra predictors, extra independent variables that we also want to test. It's not our main attraction, it's kind of a sideshow, but we still want to test it. So it's just more independent predictor variables we think are also related to the outcome. It lets us qualify the result a little bit, because maybe you say, did you know that knowing a kid's age will help us predict how much they're offending? The famous age-crime relationship. And people are like, well, that's great, but what if you only tested males versus females? But what about kids that come from divorced homes or single-parent homes? What about kids that are in different income level homes, that have higher or lower incomes? And you go, okay. So they're kind of qualifying the result. Well, yeah, maybe you do find that age has a relationship with crime as far as how much kids offend. But wouldn't some other things also matter and also predict kids offending? Well, yeah, all kinds of stuff matters. So a lot of times we'll throw in these control variables like gender and race and income and education and maybe other things that we think also influence that result, and we call it a control variable. We control for those other things that may also matter just to make sure we qualify that response. Well, even despite race and gender and income and education, age still matters. It's still a very strong predictor of when a kid's going to make an offense. So we took all that in mind. Yeah, we controlled for that. We accounted for that. It still matters. So it's a way to again qualify that result and say, yes, I took all these things into account and still ran the test. They all matter, but my other independent variable still matters. We're not as interested in the relationship, but we understand that they also matter and also influence the result. So it's kind of ancillary, but again, it lets you defend your result when people try to poke at it. I bet you didn't account for males versus females. I bet you didn't account for income. You can go, actually, I did, and I found out this, and this. Okay, so it's a way to kind of beat them to the, cut to the chase and say, hey, no, I did take those things into account, and you're right, they actually do matter. But in this way. And so that way you kind of defend yourself in advance. Okay, so here's the very last part of the lecture, how to frame a research question. So this is where you want to start thinking about independent variables and dependent variables, okay? So the easiest way to just frame a question is, how does A impact B? That's it. So A is your independent variable, B is your dependent variable. I'm going to move myself again. How does being a college student impact underage drinking? So in that question, what's the independent variable? Being a college student. What's the dependent variable? What's the outcome that we're interested in finding out what happens? Underage drinking. So we think knowing your status of being a college student or not and something about being a college student might impact the thing that you do called underage drinking. Here's another one. How do having court liaisons for youth help juveniles finish adjudication? So we think that finishing adjudication has to do with the people you interact with in court. So we think the presence of a court liaison versus maybe not having one may have an influence over kids finishing. Okay, so we'd want to test that. The independent variable is having a court liaison. The dependent variable is finishing adjudication. So usually they occur in that kind of a sequence where you see the independent first and the dependent second. Here's the last one. How does education impact starting salary as a police officer? This is a real question that I had a student test because they told me, Jensen, I think you're full of crap. I don't think finishing my bachelor's degree in criminology is really going to influence my salary. And I said, want to bet? Let's test it. So we actually went into some police data that had salary information across 96 different police departments, large and small, all over the United States. And we also had education level of incoming new cops, as well as supervisors, okay? And we actually ran tests, statistical tests, to see, does having a bachelor's degree increase your starting salary as a police officer? Guess what it does. On average, having a bachelor's degree or higher increased that starting salary in police departments across the country by $14,000 on average. And then, of course, you had more experience and training and advancement on top of that. That's a big deal. So that kind of convinced him that he needed to graduate so he could actually make good on that degree and get paid a little more. But yeah, so these are real questions that students have asked in papers, a few examples. But think of something you're really passionate about. Maybe it's victim advocacy. Maybe it's different styles of policing. Maybe it's court stuff. Maybe it's inmates, drug use. It could be a certain kind of offense, a certain kind of offender. So think about, what are you passionate about in criminology that we have data on that you can maybe form a question like this. Now, occasionally people are like, I'm really into serial killers. Well, yes, they are fascinating. It's hard to get data on serial killers because they don't represent most murderers. Serial killers are extremely rare, and it's hard to find a random sample of serial killers out there. So you have to be kind of practical about what topic you want, whether we have data on it so we can run some statistical tests for your project. So if you're curious, you want to run by some topics, send me some emails of some ideas if you're kind of playing with some stuff, and we'll look at how doable it is. We'll kind of vet it out and see if we have some data on that. But now is not too early to start brainstorming a topic and thinking about, what do I want as my independent variable? What do I want as my dependent? But think of it as, how does A impact B? That's the easy way to start thinking about it. I'll have a list of more examples you can choose from to get those thoughts moving for you. So that's the end of the lecture, 13 minutes, and we'll see you next time.